A split verdict involving two Aurora officers involved in the death of Elijah McClain. A jury finds Officer Randy Roedema guilty of criminally negligent homicide and third-degree assault. The second officer, Jason Rosenblatt, not guilty.
No, it's not enough, because Roedema wasn't alone in what he did to my son.
A mom seeking more justice, more than 4 years after her son was stopped by Aurora police despite not having done anything wrong, taken to the ground, restrained, and given ketamine by paramedics. A third Aurora police officer is set to stand trial this month. Two paramedics who injected the ketamine stand trial next month. We take a deeper look next. A split verdict. At 4:46 p.m., a jury found one Aurora officer, Randy Roedema, guilty in the 2019 death of Elijah McClain. The other, former Aurora officer, Jason Rosenblatt, not guilty.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Randy Roedema, guilty of criminally negligent homicide. Jury verdict for the charge of assault in the second degree. We, the jury, find the defendant, Randy Roedema, guilty of assault in the third degree.
Roedema, the one found guilty, will be sentenced in January. My colleague Chris Vanderveen, you've followed this case closely. And I remember in 2020, we're in the newsroom, the protests of 2020 were going on, and you pointed this case out as something that we were hearing about George Floyd, but no one was at that moment talking about Elijah McClain.
At least not nationally, and this is an important distinction. In that time in 2020, there weren't a lot of people that were talking about nationally about the Elijah McClain case. That all changed near the end of those, beginning at the middle of those protests, where people started to talk about it a lot, and eventually it became a national story. But for about 8 or 9 months, this country largely did not know of the Elijah McClain case.
That seems bizarre, too, at the time with a death like this. And I know you've looked into the reports, the autopsy reports, the conflicting autopsy reports that I guess caused some consternation probably with this jury because it took many days to come up with this split verdict.
That was a very, very difficult aspect of this case, is that you had essentially one autopsy and then you had an amended autopsy done by Dr. Stephen Sheneen in the Adams County Coroner's Office. The first autopsy said, we really don't know how he died. The second autopsy said, I think it was ketamine. But the problem was, in this case, who administered the ketamine? It wasn't the police officers. It were the paramedics that were involved that are going to be tried later. And that was a complicating factor. Now, clearly, the jury today said, we believe that one of those officers, Randy Roedema, was criminally responsible for the death. But they also said another officer is not.
They got conflicting testimony from this trial of one said it was just the ketamine that killed McClain. Another part of the testimony from someone else was it was a combination of the ketamine and the officer's actions.
That's why you suspect it sort of took a long time for this jury, at least a couple of days, 2 days and a half to sort of reach this verdict, is because it was a complicated case that involved all of those factors. In the end, the jury seemed to say, we believe that maybe the ketamine was responsible, but we also believe when it comes to Randy Roedema that the restraint, he was the one that had him on the ground. Jason Rosenblatt had walked away from the scene for a while. And because of that, they seem to be putting a lot of the criminal responsibility, in fact, all of the criminal responsibility when it comes to these two officers, on Roedema and not on Jason Rosenblatt. It's an interesting verdict today. But if you start to pay attention to the case, you see some of the dynamics that makes the jury's verdict possible.
This was the result of a grand jury indictment. And I've heard if you want to get an indictment from a grand jury, you just have to show up and you're probably going to get that indictment. But then you actually have to go to the trial.
And then you have to go to the trial. This is a victory in small part to the AG's office that was urged by the governor's office to, in fact, bring this indictment forward. You have to go back to 2020 when the governor injected himself into this conversation and said, we need to go to a grand jury. Phil Weiser brought the case to a grand jury. Grand jury issued indictments. And today, at least in part, that decision by the governor and by Attorney General Weiser does come to fruition in terms of leading to at least one conviction.
We're going to look more at that timeline in just a moment. Thank you, Chris.
You bet.
This case, as you've heard, may never have gotten to this point had it not been for those protests and pleas from Elijah's mother, Sheneen McClain. She spoke about her son's death during rallies for George Floyd, and I vividly remember her plea to George Floyd protesters at the state capitol in June 2020 about not being there for her son, but thankful that they were there now. 9 News anchor Alex Lewis spoke with Sheneen after the verdict. And Alex, this split verdict is not what she was seeking.
No, it really wasn't. I mean, the second we knew there was a verdict, they opened up the courtroom doors, we all piled in. I don't know that I've ever felt that much tension and anticipation in my life. It was incredibly emotional for everybody, but none more than Sheneen, who was sobbing after these verdicts were read, and they were not happy tears. You know, she has been at this trial almost nearly every single day of the 3 weeks, and she spent the last 2 days while the jury has been deliberating, sitting on a bench, sometimes pacing, just waiting patiently for this verdict. And when I spoke to her, even earlier today, she thought it was a slam dunk. She thought the prosecution did an incredible job trying this case, and she really thought that both of these officers would be found guilty of the charges that they were facing. So for Rosenblatt to completely be convicted of the charges today, and then for Randy Roedema to be charged with lesser charges than were initially on the table, she views this split verdict as anything but victory. Is this justice?
No, it's not. It's not justice. This is not justice. This is a misuse of taxpayer money.
Even with Roedema getting 2 guilty charges, not enough?
No, it's not enough, because Roedema wasn't alone in what he did to my son. He had accomplices. He had buddies with badges that are all bullies. So it's not a victory for me. This is not a victory for me at all. This is not a victory for the human race. This is not a victory for justice.
When you look at the range of sentencing that Roedema is facing, it is probation to 6 years. And for him to be charged with 6 years, I mean, they have to look at extreme circumstances. He is eligible for probation. He doesn't have a record. He's a police officer. So he very well could not see a day of jail time. We don't know that, but that is a possibility that Sheneen is very well aware of. There was a really poignant moment, I think, in closing arguments 2 days ago where the prosecution put up a screen, and it was 10 police officers, like blank faces. It was 4, 2 of the paramedics, 2 of the EMTs, and it was the 14 representing 14 people who were on the scene that day, August in 2019. And Sheneen has always been very vocal about saying every single person who was on that scene when her son was laying on the ground, essentially dying, going into cardiac arrest, that they all should have been charged. So she was not happy today, and she is very well aware that this is just kind of the beginning, trial 1 of 3. The second will start tomorrow, essentially, and there's a long road ahead. Marshall.
Yeah, she has to digest this, and in less than, 12 hours now, or I guess like 16 hours, she's back in court for the jury selection for this next trial. Did you get a chance to talk with her about what she thinks this might mean for those other cases?
She is not as hopeful, honestly, even after the split verdict, 1 conviction, 1 not. You know, she doesn't know what's coming when you look at the paramedics, and there was some strong evidence against the paramedics even in this trial. Next, we start with Nathan Woodyard with jury selection tomorrow as they'll fill out the questionnaire. She really isn't as hopeful going into this second trial as she was when I spoke to her going into the first.
Alex, thanks for being out there and speak with her right after this trial, and we know we're going to hear from her as these next 2 take place. Thanks a lot. Aurora Police Chief Art Acevedo released a statement following the verdict. It reads in part, "I know many have been waiting a long time for the involved parties to have their day in court. We respect the verdict handed down by the jury and thank the members of the jury for their thoughtful deliberation and service." That's a whole lot of nothing, probably because jury selection in the trial for a 3rd Aurora officer, as Alex mentioned, Nathan Woodyard, that starts tomorrow. The 2 paramedics, Jeremy Cooper and Peter Chikuniak, are scheduled to go to trial next month. As Chris alluded to, it was June 2020 when Democratic Governor Jared Polis ordered Democratic Attorney General Phil Weiser to open an investigation into what happened. In September 2021, Weiser announced charges in this case. In a statement today, the Attorney General said, "Today's verdict is about accountability. Everyone is accountable and equal under the law, and hopefully today's verdict is another step in the healing process for the Aurora community and the state. One of the ways we can honor Elijah McClain's memory is to continue our work to improve policing and build trust between law enforcement and the people they are sworn to protect." And the police reform accountability law in Colorado came out of the George Floyd protests that put Elijah McClain's death on the national stage. A college student made a simple mistake that cost him his life. Now his family is trying to prevent what happened to him from happening to others. That's next. Their son went to college, and he died after taking something he didn't realize was laced with fentanyl. The parents who believe that are turning their grief into action. Kelly Rinke shows us their campaign at universities across the state.
Just a really, really bright, stubborn, gritty kid.
A picture reminds parents about what made their son shine.
He was on the dean's list. He was salutatorian of his high school class.
Memories also take a family back. This picture is one of the last the Pannings took with Ross.
So my son Ross died in between his junior and senior year up at CU Boulder.
Carrie Panning and her husband Ryan say their very smart son made a decision that cost his life. While at school, they say he took a drug, not knowing it was laced with fentanyl.
I want every student to know what the risk is of experimenting.
2 years after losing Ross, the couple is leaving a message for new students on campus. You can't outsmart fentanyl as part of their new education campaign at colleges across the state, including CU Boulder. They worked on this idea with other families who also lost a kid in college to fentanyl.
But we felt like our son Ross, like if their posters were up, he would read that and he would think about it.
So we felt like we had the obligation in a way to use what we had learned and kind of turn pain into power.
Dawn Reinfeld helped bring these families together over the past year. Together with her organization Blue Rising, they partner with 10 colleges in Colorado, sharing posters and actions they'd like to see to keep kids safe, like putting naloxone in every residence hall.
Some universities are doing everything. They're using our signage, they're educating their students in the way and the frequency that we're asking.
I think finally, okay, we've got buy-in.
They want to save parents from their pain by sharing a warning their kid never got.
It's easy to say that can't touch me.
Now, this campaign launched this month, and some campuses are incorporating this partnership with existing efforts on campus to teach students about fentanyl. Blue Rising said that colleges don't have to pay for anything to participate. They have funding from outside sources.
That's got to be both incredibly difficult and also heartwarming in a way to use this moment to try to help others and get these other universities involved.
They were talking about how Ross wanted to help people, and in a way, his death is doing that. What also gives him a lot of comfort is it's not just adults who are participating. They're having a lot of buy-in from the students as well that are creating support groups, and also having that messaging come from a student may actually be more powerful coming from someone their age than an adult saying, you know, this is something that you should look out for.
Thanks for highlighting that, Kelly. Appreciate it.
It's been a busy day around Colorado as far as the weather goes. 30, 40, 50 mile per hour wind gusts, especially across those higher mountain passes. 30 plus mile per hour speeds across the urban corridor and off to the eastern plains. They too are dealing with strong winds. The high wind warning will continue until lunchtime tomorrow for our far eastern counties. Winds upwards of 60 miles per hour as this storm system continues to charge off to the east. As we zoom back in, you can kind of see that heavy snowfall right against our border with Montana. Still a lot of snowfall up in the mountain areas, and possibly a little rain snow mix here in Denver. The advisories will continue until 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, potentially another 8 inches of snowfall stacking up. An absolute winter wonderland out there. We have freeze warnings going across the northwestern and southwestern corner of Colorado, the San Luis Valley, plus a freeze watch for much of eastern Colorado Friday night into Saturday morning. Let's watch the futurecast. Here we are, 7 o'clock tonight. Scattered snow showers up in the mountains, and right there about midnight, a little rain, possibly some snowfall once you head further south toward the Palmer Divide. Everything clears out by tomorrow morning, and tomorrow really should be a dry day statewide. Still cool and still pretty windy as we watch that storm system move off to the east and this ridge of high pressure build back in. Daytime highs returning to the 50s for us, 40s at best up in the mountains. There's that freeze early on Saturday, so heads up Denver. We're back to the 70s and possibly 80s early next week.
By the look of that map, Danielle, it looked a little frosty in Douglas County. Leaders there say they support migrants in need as long as they don't come to Douglas County. That's next. Douglas County does not want anything to do with Denver's migrant crisis, and now county commissioners are calling on Denver to roll up the welcome mat. Today, Republican Douglas County Commissioners Abe Layden and George Teal passed a resolution calling on Denver Mayor Mike Johnston to reverse the city's 2017 resolution declaring Denver a sanctuary city. That's not an official designation, but it means Denver limits cooperation with federal immigration enforcement. Denver's currently straining to shelter more than 3,000 migrants from the southern border out of the more than 23,000 who have traveled to Denver since December. Denver Mayor Mike Johnston is calling for a regional approach in the absence of federal and state assistance. Today, Douglas County made it clear that county won't help with the sheltering effort.
Douglas County expressly affirms that the county is not a sanctuary jurisdiction. Denver does not have the resources or infrastructure to address the human needs it is currently facing. And whereas adding to that burden by making itself a sanctuary city and imposing that on the Denver metropolitan area is unacceptable to those we represent.
Douglas County calls the resolution a proactive step to keep Denver from outsourcing migrant sheltering across county lines. Johnston's office says it's not operating any shelters in Douglas County and that today's resolution was disappointing and disheartening, but not the only county concerned about Denver's migrant crisis spilling over. Earlier this week, the Adams County Board of Health passed an order requiring detailed records for any migrant shelters after that county discovered Denver was temporarily housing migrants in facilities in Adams County. Denver's elected leaders want more of a say when it comes to Denver public schools. Remember, the city of Denver and DPS are separate entities. Next week, city council members will consider reviving a joint committee meant to bridge the gap between school and city leadership. Denver Councilwoman Amanda Sandoval is one of two council members sponsoring a resolution to revive what they're calling a city-school coordinating committee. They want to set up a 7-person committee of school board members, the superintendent, council members, and the mayor to meet multiple times a year to discuss school policy. The proposal was announced today by education leaders, members of council, Mayor Mike Johnston again, and former mayors Wellington Webb and Federico Pena. They cited recent concerns with school safety, like the debate over school resource officers and the district's discipline matrix, which allows students charged with violent crimes to return to class. Sandoval says the proposal was drafted in conjunction with school board members, but none of them spoke at that news conference today announcing the proposal. The first draft is going to go in front of a city council committee next week. And we're back with your feedback. Less than 2 hours ago, a jury in Aurora came out with a split verdict for 2 officers involved in the death of Elijah McClain. Officer Randy Roedema, guilty of criminally negligent homicide and third-degree assault. The second officer, Jason Rosenblatt, not guilty. It took more than 4 years to get here after those Aurora police officers stopped and restrained McClain, who did nothing wrong, and paramedics gave him ketamine. We spoke to his mother today, who said this is not justice for her son's death. Jury selection for the third officer charged in Elijah McClain's death begins tomorrow. The 2 paramedics who injected him with ketamine stand trial next month. We've been following this case closely for years, and we'll have more tonight on 9 News at 9 and 10. Feedback about McClain. A former officer who writes us often, Michael Katz, says, not doing anything wrong, neither did the officers. Well, today, Officer Katz, a jury disagrees with your assessment, at least for one of the officers, Roedema, who they found guilty, while the other one, Rosenblatt, was found not guilty. Feedback from Trish. Why is the other police officer being tried separately? An excellent question. The judge in this case determined the makeup of the 3 separate trials in an effort to keep it fair for all the defendants because of the different roles each of the 5 had. That's why the 2 officers were together. Their roles were considered similar. This third officer not, and the paramedics separate because they're being charged with the injection of the ketamine and their involvement in that. Again, we'll update tonight on 9 and 10, and we'll see you with probably some better news tomorrow. We'll see you next time.